Okay, we're now going to cite some news items from Asia and emerging nations. We do not use and we will never use the Western wires. We will not use Reuters, Bloomberg, Agence France Presse, Associated Press, and so on, which is always slanted with the perspective of the West and the interest of the West. But anyway, this first item, which has been very controversial at least this past week, about the China-ASEAN meeting in Kunming and the confusion that resulted with a premature release of non-authorized statement, which Indonesia now clarifies. Can we start this? Indonesia cites error as ASEAN meeting ends in confusion. And this was the wording of the initial press release from Malaysia. Anyway, now Indonesia says, this past June 15, that a bold statement from Southeast Asian nations raising concern over Beijing's island building in the South China Sea was issued in error, as a meeting over the issue ended in confusion. Now, Indonesia says this was just a guideline and not an ASEAN statement. So the initial issuance was retracted by Malaysia. And there are, of course, different allegations as to why this happened. I think, Bobby, this reflects really the tension within ASEAN of the issue on the South China Sea. We are aware that an arbitration decision is said to be coming very soon. What's your reaction to this this situation that cropped up?
I am not surprised at this particular news account regarding this so-called confusion generated by a draft statement, which turned out to be guidelines, that were meant to draft the final statement or communique at the end of the ASEAN-China foreign ministers meeting. We should not be surprised, I think, because there has never really been one ASEAN. Even if ASEAN, a regional economic and security cooperation association, was established way back in 1967, there has been no real, structure and system and arrangement that would really make ASEAN a truly regional association, having a common policy. The working mechanism within ASEAN is consensus building. They hardly make any decision or resolution based on voting.
That's right. That's right.
Raising your hands, yes or no, whatsoever.
Yes.
And that has been a deliberate organizational principle within ASEAN, because they don't want to divide ASEAN, but at the same time, they don't want to. It would be difficult to really pursue a common position, considering the varying, the differing commitments and interests of the ASEAN countries, most especially on regional and even on international issues.
Yeah, earlier we were going back to the history of ASEAN, and I was saying it really is an emanation from SEATO, which was a Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which was a military alliance, but with the changing conditions in the late 60s, and ASEAN wishing to distance a bit from that old Cold War institution, but still basically an emanation from the anti-communist regimes of that period. Now, later, ASEAN broadened to include the Indochina states, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and so on, which has fundamentally some geographical differences with the China Sea side, South China Sea side nations, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on. And that
so
seems
it's a Cold War structure. It was built in 1967 in the context of the Cold War politics. And it began with just 5 or 6 member states, and it really essentially began with a very strong anti-communist and even anti-China position.
Yeah, yeah.
So basically, when ASEAN emerged, it was a structure that practically divided the whole Southeast Asian region, with ASEAN claiming to be the pro-democracy association, the rest of Asia or Southeast Asia, including Indochina, Vietnam, Laos as pro-communist. So there was it began as a very divisive regional association. That kind of organizational phase began to fade away as soon as the Cold War politics ended way back in 1990, and it became more inclusive to include Vietnam, Laos, and
That's right.
other Southeast Asian countries. That used to be, well, that used to be called by the ASEAN founding members as communist.
So my final question here is, they keep alleging that China is using Laos, Cambodia, and some of the states close to China in dividing ASEAN. But isn't that the point about having a consensus-based organization, that everybody's interest is taken care of? Because on the other hand, other states say that the Philippines is being used by the Americans as a fulcrum inside ASEAN.
In fact, not only historically, but even by today's standards, ASEAN has always been one association that could not really adopt a very strong common position. I mean, regardless of whether China is relating with ASEAN or not, ASEAN really, as an association, has not found any occasion where it adopted a unified position vis-a-vis critical regional issues, territorial disputes, and so on and so forth. The reason, as I said, is that essentially when ASEAN began, and today, the character of ASEAN has this historical beginning where it came about as a result of Cold War politics.
Right,
and the defense alliances, the economic alignments of the founding member states, and in some countries in ASEAN have remained historically from and originating from that Cold War politics. Like, for instance, the Philippines is strongly aligned with the U.S., even if there is already an ASEAN, understanding of being non-partisan,
That's right.
independent,
Non-aligned.
not adopting a warlike position, etc.
Okay, let's move on. That's why I say emerging nations too, our news perspective. Here's an item from Telesur, the common broadcast media of the Latin American countries.
Okay.
And here it says, Nicaragua expelled several U.S. officials, according to the U.S. State Department, which is complaining about this. The Nicaraguan authorities says the U.S. officials' anti-terrorism activities were carried out without the knowledge or the proper consultation with Nicaraguan authorities, which is very delicate and sensitive. Okay. The Nicaraguan government told the U.S. government of the necessity to inform them, Nicaragua, about official missions that come to Nicaragua and to coordinate their work. There are few points here. One, so-called war on terrorism, which apparently the Americans feel that they have now licensed to, go into any country and investigate and so on. What's your take on this?
Well, Nicaragua, of course, is one particular country in Latin America which has been a victim of, or the target of, U.S. Foreign policy intervention way back in the 1970s and 1980s. So, the U.S. is some kind of it's a superpower that has adopted the policy of what it calls preemptive anti-terrorist actions. So it can go, in other words, a borderless war on terrorism. That may have been true in after 9/11, but to continue adopting such policy, especially in the case of Nicaragua, is really is marks of modern day intervention policy, meddling in one's national territory and sovereignty, even without the modicum of, informing or even conducting joint, let's say, if the Nicaraguan government would agree, they can conduct joint anti-terrorist activities. But that's already.
I get the impression that this smacks of the same thing that we are seeing in the South China Sea, where the U.S. insists that they have the right for military and naval freedom of operation, while the contention of China and some other countries is that commercial and merchant marine, yes, but with military entering into internal waters and so on, even the Philippines, there should be at least information given to the host country.
It's typical of what we can call typical of a gunboat diplomacy. Nicaragua is part of Central America and the Western Hemisphere, and historically since 1823, since the Monroe Doctrine, the South American seas have been considered as part of the territory of the U.S. And for that matter, it claims South China Sea as part of its Western Pacific domain.
Yes,
and of course, that is based on its claim that the U.S. will remain a superpower
and the
an Asia-Pacific
the
power.
global policeman.
Yes, a global policeman.
Okay. We have another item, this time from the Russian media. This is from Russia Today, RT News. And the headline is, "I don't need war," according to the Bulgarian Prime Minister. The Bulgarian Prime Minister rules out joining NATO flotilla in the Black Sea. And I always say that I want the Black Sea to see sailboats, yachts, large boats with tourists, and not become an arena of military action. I do not need a war in the Black Sea, says Bulgaria's Prime Minister Boyko Borisov during a media briefing. And apparently this is becoming a very hot cauldron between the U.S. and Russia, the Black Sea. Do you have a background on this region and the politics here, the geopolitics here?
Insofar as Russia is concerned, it looks like the Cold War politics of the U.S. has not ended, despite the fact that it was supposed to end in 1990. And now that Russia is emerging fast as a growing economic power in Europe and also globally, and trying to tighten its security in order to protect the Russian sovereignty and Russian territory. And it is threatened by indications that the U.S. and also North Atlantic Treaty Organization may be squeezing
encircling
tighter,
encircling
Russia. So if you have that kind of situation, it really becomes inevitable that Russia should really secure its borders and make sure that no preemptive activities by the U.S. are done as to threaten the territory of Russia.
Of course, Russia is the largest oil and natural gas power in the world.
In the world, yes.
And the major supplier of the European continent.
Yes.
Okay. Well, we're going to end this segment, but I wonder if you read the many facets of China in the Manila Bulletin every Tuesday, and the windows to China in the Star every Tuesday also.
Yes.
It's my way of getting in touch with the with China's policy directions, and they do this because they cannot get the regular access that the Western sources would get to our mainstream media. Okay, Bobby, we're going to take this break, and finally we'll focus on Philippine and China relations and issues. Okay, let's take this break.